All right, good evening, everyone.
Good evening, sir.
You all are about to go on some missions that I can't tell you about here on the mess decks. You're in a very dangerous part of the world right now.
The U.S. Navy has a nuclear submarine that could destroy Russia and China in minutes.
The most deadly of the real-life kaiju prowling the oceans today are the 14 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. Each of the 170-meter-long vessels can carry 24 Trident II submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which can be fired from underwater to strike at targets more than 7,000 miles away. As a Trident II re-enters the atmosphere at speeds of up to Mach 24, it splits into up to 8 independent re-entry vehicles, each with a 100 or 475 kiloton nuclear warhead. A full salvo from an Ohio-class submarine, which can be launched in less than 1 minute, could unleash up to 192 nuclear warheads to wipe 24 cities off the map.
What possible excuse could there be for such monstrous nation-destroying weaponry to be used?
Good evening. Australians awoke this morning to a shift in the world order. The federal government moved to very publicly align its defence allegiance with the United States and the United Kingdom. The new defence and security partnership comes with an eye-watering price tag and a shift to nuclear power for the next fleet of submarines. The $90 billion deal with French company Naval Group and the French government has been torn up, and with it, some of the goodwill between the two nations. But the real target of this shift is China. Australia now publicly tying itself to the Biden and Johnson administrations in a move likely to inflame Beijing.
President Biden, joined by the Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom and Australia,
in sync across 3 continents. Leaders broadcasting a joint press conference over afternoon tea, dinner and breakfast.
Well, good morning from Australia.
With a global message.
Today, we're taking another historic step to deepen and formalize cooperation among all 3 of our nations.
The first task of this partnership will be to help Australia acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines.
The future of the Indo-Pacific will impact all our futures.
Now trilaterally tightly bound.
Thank you, Boris. And I want to thank that fellow down under. Thank you very much, pal.
A new diplomatic club has been launched.
And so, friends, AUKUS is born.
AUKUS. It sounds strange in all these acronyms, but it's a good one.
Good evening. Australia is about to embark on a 3-decades-long mission to build a sovereign nuclear-powered submarine fleet, one of the most expensive programs in the nation's history. In a joint media appearance with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, the US and UK leaders have delivered public backing to share their tightly controlled nuclear capability secrets in order to make it happen. The next phase of the AUKUS Pact means Australia will buy 3 existing Virginia-class submarines from the US, pending approval from Congress, with an option to buy another 2. Australia and the UK will also work on a joint design of a new class of submarine, the next class for both countries. The cost, up to $368 billion over the next 30 years.
And yes, we do live in a world with bullies, but again, I think we need to get away from the hypocrisy and not look at this as just those people, the enemy, doing this. I think we need to hold up a mirror and look at ourselves as well. You know, Rothold what role has the United States played in wars since the Second World War? The United States is virtually never at peace. So can the United States preach about the need for peace? And the answer to that would be no, probably they can't. Can Australia preach about the need for peace? Well, Australia has done some very good things, and yet when Australia goes to join every US war, practically without exception, without considering the merits of that war, without considering is this really going to help peace or is it not, then we've got a lot of thinking to do about our own role, and Australia could do a lot more to promoting a more peaceful world.
As we stand at the inflection point in history, the United States can ask for no better partners in the Indo-Pacific, where so much of our shared future will be written.
Whatever the challenges ahead, the cause of peace and freedom that we share will prevail.
3 democracies that are coming together again to fulfill that higher purpose of maintaining freedom, peace, and security.
We all have laid on us today a duty to be prepared, to be strong, not with the strength of a bully, but with the strength of a deliverer. The world needs the United States of America. The world needs the British peoples of the world. The world needs every scrap of democratic strength. May all that you stand for and that we stand for be preserved under the providence of God for the happiness of mankind.
While still maintaining its traditional links with Mother England, Australia firmly aligned itself with the American camp.
Today in Australia, Reds openly preach their gospel, flout our laws, and form a growing menace to the future of this country. Does that disturb you? It should. Let us all face the grim facts, like these Australians. United we will stand.
Korea. Vietnam.
Once again, Australia sent troops to fight with the United States. Then Saigon itself was cut off. Thousands gathered at the American embassy trying to get out with the last of their departing allies, driven by rumors of what the North Vietnamese would do when they finally won. Huge bribes were offered to get aboard the departing helicopters, but there were too many people and too few planes. On the aircraft carriers offshore, helicopters worth millions of dollars were ditched to make room for more people. And then the last helicopter left.
Two wars in Iraq.
Light them all up. Come on, fire. They're right in. Keep shooting.
I watched it on the TV. Machine guns fired towards the ground. I watched the people run. helicopter gunship strafing the street. I watch them lining up the bars.
Alright, you're clear. I'm just trying to find
In
targets.
the Baghdad.
Master 6, this is Bushmaster 2-6.
They say these leaks had consequences, and I must agree.
And a bunch of bodies laying there.
When I saw them fire on the children,
Alright, we got about 8 individuals.
it affected me.
Hey, request permission to
20 years in Afghanistan.
It's been 20 years since a US-led coalition ousted the Taliban in 2001 following the 9/11 attacks. 41 Australians were killed on operational deployments to Afghanistan. 454 British personnel lost their lives, and almost 2,300 US troops have died. During that time, more than 120,000 Afghan military, police, and civilians have lost their lives.
Albo, when will we ever learn?
Hundreds packed inside this jet. As the Strong clung to an air bridge, the increasingly distraught tried to scale airport walls.
The Prime Minister has also lashed out at the militant group after it said Australian soldiers who were killed during fighting in Afghanistan had died in vain.
We have no reason to believe we can actually operate these boats. I mean, this is a nuclear-powered submarine has a nuclear reactor in it. Australia has almost no experience of operating nuclear reactors, no experience at all of operating them in this kind of setting. And the demands on the Royal Australian Navy to try and get these things to work, well, put it this way, the risk that we don't get it right, the risk that we can't operate them effectively, and therefore that even the boats we have won't be able to get to sea, won't be able to fight effectively, is very high. So I think it's a classic example that the Navy, the government, is going for something sort of
bells and whistles.
Exactly, glitzy and glamorous and sounds great. But in terms of practically delivering real military capability, it makes no sense at all.
There is apparently no argument in the Defence Department that what we need to do is to build nuclear-powered submarines which can sail a long way for a long time, and their only rational strategic utility is helping the Americans in a war against China.
Not even Peter Dutton, when he's Defence Minister, said that he expected China to try and occupy Australia. Well, that being the case, you've got to ease back a bit how they're a threat to Australia, and what sense are they a threat, and why are we building so much military equipment and trying to get nuclear submarines and that to stand off China and be involved in a war with China.
China has shown no interest. There's not one single shred of evidence that China wants to invade Australia. So why on earth would we consider getting involved with the Yanks in another of their follies with our biggest trading partner?
The US is Australia's vital security ally. It's our closest global partner.
We're more effective when we stand and work together.
More of that work to be done in Australia, with confirmation of increased American military rotations. Australia's AUKUS deal for nuclear-powered submarines also discussed behind closed doors.
China's dangerous and coercive actions throughout the Indo-Pacific, including around Taiwan, toward the Pacific Island countries, and in the East and South China Seas, threaten regional peace and stability.
We face a world in which the strategic environment is as complex and precarious
really, as at any point since the end of the Second World War.
Well, the nuclear submarines is just a symptom of this whole ongoing problem of our alliance with the United States and more or less doing whatever is in the perceived to be in the United States' interest. And yes, indeed, Australia's neighbours, especially Indonesia, are deeply concerned about the prospect of nuclear submarines for Australia and the possibility of an arms race within our region. And they're concerned for very good reason, because the nuclear submarines are highly destabilising, provocative, and they are a very significant nuclear weapons proliferation risk.
It's designed to counter China, but Indonesia doesn't like the idea of nuclear-powered submarines patrolling its neighbourhood.
The central pillar of Australian security remains its alliance with the United States.
The AUKUS arrangements with our allies in the United States and the UK will serve the interests of our three nations.
It's big power politics, it's about dominance, and frankly, it looks quite racist. 3 Anglo nations encircling China. It's hard to see it in terms that are, in terms other than racism.
Mr. Miles says he had constructive talks with the US National Security Advisor before meeting Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin in the Pentagon.
Thinking about what is the best option for Australia, we are very mindful that it would be advantageous to be operating a submarine which is being operated elsewhere as well.
It's all very well to say that the United States reinforcement of Australia's defence capability enhances our sovereignty, but that is only if Australia actually retains truly effective and independent command of Australian armed forces.
If you're going to have anything approaching independent defence policy or foreign policy, you must be able to keep your equipment separate. You can't do all your training based on the idea that all the forces are integrated, etc. It's too late at the day that the war's about to start, say, no, we don't want to be in it. You've got to say from the beginning, we will not engage in any wars of aggression, because that's against the UN Charter, it's against the Anzac Treaty. Of course, no one seems to care, but you are breaking the law every time you put troops into say, in Vietnam or Iraq like that. That's a breach of the ANZUS Treaty.
By 2040, 2050, Australian submarines planning to sail through Indonesian waters up through the Philippines and the South China Sea to the East China Sea to sit outside Shanghai are going to be facing a very different underwater surveillance balance than what exists at present. Will those submarines even be a rational answer to any strategic problem at that time? And will they be anything other than a suicide activity for Australian sailors?
We could buy 25 really good conventionally powered submarines for the price we'll pay, we hope to pay, for 8 nuclear powered submarines. We get 3 times as many submarines. And numbers really matter. You know, the more boats you have out there, the more of the other guy's ships you're going to sink, the more damage you'll do to him. So the fact that nuclear submarines are so expensive and therefore drive down the numbers we can afford is a really big issue. Now, the government often says the first boat will be delivered sometime around 2040, but the first boat doesn't matter, because one boat isn't a capability. We need, and we know this, we need 6 boats. 6 boats is the absolute minimum viable operational capability. And on the very most optimistic estimates, we won't have 6 boats until the middle of the 2050s. Now, the fact is that the strategic contest over the future of Asia will be long over by then. And we're in very grave danger of facing the most dangerous decades we've seen since the 1940s without any submarine capability at all.
Is there an argument for some interim submarine capability? And is that interim submarine capability just interim, or is it what we actually really need in reality, if we have a rational assessment of credible defence contingencies? what other defence capabilities do we not build with that 100, 200 billion or possibly $500 billion submarine cost, and how do those unfunded defence capabilities leave us vulnerable? More to say nothing about social security systems.
Good evening. It's been 1 year since air raid sirens rang out in cities across Ukraine. 1 year since war returned to Europe after Russian forces launched a pre-dawn invasion in what President Vladimir Putin described as a special military operation. February the 24th is now forever etched in the minds of Ukrainians whose lives changed in an instant. The largest assault on a European country since World War II has killed thousands of civilians. The UN says 8,000 have died, but says the real number is much higher. Western intelligence puts it at 40,000, and the United States estimates that the combined number of military casualties on both sides has passed 200,000. More than 14 million people have been displaced.
Saudi Arabian oil giant Aramco has reported the highest ever annual profit by a publicly listed company, much of it attributed to high energy prices in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Analysts say the $240 billion windfall is critical for the kingdom's plans to expand its influence on global financial and energy markets.
It is the world's second richest company and largest oil producer. Aramco is pivotal to Saudi Arabia's extensive wealth and power. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine saw oil prices soar, the state-owned oil giant made a record $240 billion profit last year, a mammoth 47% rise from 2021. America's ExxonMobil recorded $84 billion profit, and Britain's Shell with $60 billion.
Scientists are warning the world is on track to warm by 2.4 degrees over the century, the alarming development discussed at the COP26 climate change conference. The new study suggests that even if the 2030 carbon emission reduction goals promised by world leaders are met, the world is still on track for catastrophic warming. Those behind the research are urging governments to set more ambitious targets.
Pakistan blaming wealthy countries for inaction. The country's climate minister taking a swipe at G20 leaders who gathered in Rome just days before COP.
Climate change cannot be wished away by throwing pennies into the Trevi fountain.
7 months after COP26 finished in Glasgow, and the world's leaders tossed a symbolic penny into the wishing well, hoping for the best for the planet, before heading home in their private jets, the people of Pakistan paid dearly for our inaction on climate change.
Our contribution in the destruction of the planet is minimal, yet we suffer the most.
In Mozambique, the past 4 weeks has seen more than a year's worth of rainfall. Scientists are pointing to fossil fuel-driven climate change, making tropical storms stronger.
Good evening. Shocking, sobering and confronting. That's how a long-awaited report into the state of Australia's environment has been described. The 5-year scorecard finds the nation's environment is in what it's called a poor and deteriorating state. In unveiling the report today, Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek announced a new target to protect 30% of Australia's land and oceans by 2030.
A sunburnt country that's bearing the brunt of more and more natural disasters, from the Black Summer bushfires, relentless drought and unprecedented flooding events. Now the State of Environment report painting a bleak picture.
It is a sobering read. In general, most of our environments are in a poor state, and critically, their trajectory is poor as well.
Today, the new Environment Minister sharing that news gathered across the past 5 years.
A difficult, confronting and sometimes depressing story.
Describing the state of the environment as poor and deteriorating. Land temperatures have risen by 1.4 degrees since consistent records began. The nation's biodiversity decimated. Australia has lost more mammal species than any other continent, warning at least 19 ecosystems are on the brink of collapse.
Environmental crises and the biodiversity crisis have been rolling out for some time now, and we really have run out of time.
But not budging on the 2030 emissions reduction target.
On the 43% target, we made a promise to the Australian people. We're going to keep the promise.
What this report show you, not give you enough of a message to say, perhaps we need to reassess this target?
I think this report would give anyone who reads it a very strong message that we need to do better on the environment. We're only going to have one go at this.
14 Pacific delegates attended the historic two-day summit in Washington, agreeing climate change is the region's highest priority. The US has pledged to invest more than $860 million in the Pacific.
The security of America, quite frankly, and the world depends on your security and the security of the Pacific Islands, and I really mean that.
Analysts say the deal is a way for the US to counter China's influence in the Pacific after Beijing signed a security pact with Solomon Islands earlier this year.
The whole thing about the South Pacific, for example, what worries them immensely is climate change, and we're going up there filling their ear about, oh, you must be worried about China, you've got to be worried about China. And then all this stuff about, oh, China wants to have a military base there or a naval base there, it is of no military interest, that would be of no military interest to it. It can't protect the supply lines that's so far away from China. The Americans have got several bases in other islands up there, and they, and planes as well as submarines and everything, they could destroy any base that the Chinese put in very, very quickly. But we're determined to keep trying to leak that they could be used as a base.
So I think China is going to want to have a sphere of influence that covers East Asia and the Western Pacific. India is going to want to have a sphere of influence that covers South Asia and the Indian Ocean. We happen to sit on the boundaries between those two spheres of influence, and that means we're going to be pushed from both sides, which is bad, but it also means we can play both sides off against one another. So we can use the Indians to deflect the Chinese and the Chinese to deflect the Indians. That's going to be very difficult diplomacy, very different from the kind of diplomacy we've done in the past, but it's not impossible.
Climate change is the main economic and security challenge for the island countries of the Pacific.
It's very important that our political leaders stop pretending to themselves and stop pretending to the Australian electorate that everything in Washington is fine, and stop pretending that Washington has the answer to our China problem. The fact is we're going to have to find our own answer to the China problem, and it's going to be a very complex thing. It's, in some ways, I think it's one of the biggest challenges that Australia has ever faced as a country.
The military threat posed by China has prompted a dramatic review of the nation's defences. It's recommending a fundamental overhaul of Australia's approach to deal with the urgent risk of conflict. The Albanese government commissioned the review and has agreed to many of the recommendations. They've now been publicly unveiled, including a major investment in long-range missiles.
Propelling the nation into the missile age, as Labor releases a declassified version of the Defence Strategic Review.
This represents a document for today and tomorrow.
The 110-page report, undertaken by former Defence Minister Stephen Smith and former Defence Chief Sir Angus Houston, provides a sense of urgency, finding the Defence Force is not ready to deal with the increased threat of conflict in the region as a result of China's massive military build-up.
In the circumstances that we now face, that defence posture is no longer fit for purpose.
Focusing on 6 priority areas, including the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines and larger missile strike range.
We then have to think about the really serious question of how do we handle nuclear safety issues, not just at sea, and submarines have a bad history, nuclear submarines have a bad history of sinking or burning up. We also have to think about nuclear submarines in Australian ports. You have a fire at Garden Island, who knows? We have no nuclear safety regulatory capability. We do not have the engineering capabilities. We do not have the long-haul nuclear engineering, nuclear safety capabilities in our universities, in our defence colleges. Even if you think that's all a good idea, things go wrong. The list of nuclear accidents isn't just about 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl or Fukushima. There are dozens of major nuclear accidents, most of them through technological fail or human error.
The extent to which Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, which we're told are going to be fuelled with highly enriched uranium, which is nuclear bomb fuel, what is that going to do to the non-proliferation regime? And the answer is it's going to be very, very bad in terms of nuclear weapons proliferation. So our neighbours are deeply concerned.
If we do not either get very serious regulation of nuclear weapons or we're on the path to their abolition, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as a first step, or very serious restriction of the numbers and functions of nuclear weapons in ways we haven't ever seen, then we are going to be entering a world of global conflict over climate with nuclear weapons.
We will have 2 great powers that are nuclear armed going head to head. We must have the contest dying down. We must stop egging the United States on. If we don't cooperate, we're finished. That's the long and the short of it. We're finished.
Expansion of China's economy to the point where it is now the major trading partner of most countries in the world, and its increasing propensity to do deals with other countries outside of the United States dollar as the medium of exchange poses a vital challenge to the primacy of the US dollar. And that, I think, is the real motivation behind the current hostility towards China and the narrative that China is a threat. The prime directive, as far as United States policymakers are concerned, is, and has always been since the end of the Cold War, that the United States must prevent the rise of any power in the world that could challenge the position of the United States as the top dog. It was also important that they crippled Europe as well, because Western Europe was becoming an alternative pole of power through Russia as its main source of energy. The symbiotic relationship between Russia and Western Europe was something that had to be countered if the United States was to maintain its supremacy in the world.
I think America will always remain the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, but the idea of America as the dominant power in East Asia, as the dominant power globally, as the leading power in the Middle East and Europe, I don't think that would survive. None of that would survive the loss of a war with China over Taiwan. The build-up of Australia's military offensive capabilities, particularly with the eventual nuclear power submarines, but also with things like the B-52s and eventually the more modern nuclear-capable bombers being based in Australia, is all part of the process of preparing Australia to be the protagonist on behalf of the United States in a war against China. In other words, if they cannot get Taiwan to be the proxy or the patsy, then it will be Australia.
From the White House in the office of the President of the United States, we present an address by Dwight D. Eisenhower. This is the farewell address for President Eisenhower, whose 8 years as chief executive come to an end at noon Friday. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
As one who has witnessed the horror and the lingering sadness of war, as one who knows that another war could utterly destroy this civilization, which has been so slowly and painfully built over thousands of years, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction.
Australia in recent years has moved away from the great tradition we had. Australia, especially in the UN, was very strong on disarmament and working for peace. We were a big player in getting the Arms Trade Treaty up and running.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
It's profit season in the States, so there were some big companies reporting better than expected profits. The big one was the huge defence company, Lockheed Martin. That is really starting to profit from all of the global conflict that's happening at the moment. So apparently their F-35 fighter sales have been strong. That's really pushed up their revenue. I think it was about $17 billion US in revenue in just a 3-month period. So their shares skyrocketed about 9% overnight.
We won't have nuclear missiles, but we'll have missiles that could be part of an American attack on China.
Submersion ship, dive I. Dive. Dive.
These are very complicated pieces of cyber engineering and physical engineering, and they're very costly, and they're made by a very small number of companies. We know already that the French-built submarines were to have American combat systems, because we want them to be interoperable with the American Navy. They were to be built by Lockheed Martin. There are only 2 or 3 other companies in the world that could come near to producing this. Lockheed Martin is the biggest armaments company in the world. It's one of the major nuclear weapons suppliers. But we know that we have one of the problems, even in the American political system, let alone in ours, that governments have very little control over the way those companies produce defence products. And so we can expect the costs will just rise and balloon.
The federal government says it's working to get billions of dollars worth of delayed defence projects back on track. At least 28 major programs are cumulatively a century behind schedule, and 18 are over budget.
The amount of money we're spending on military equipment is just insane at the moment. There's so much overlapping and so on. It's a lot easier to work out what you need to spend on defending Australia than in trying to build a forward defence thing which is supposed to protect you. Well, so was the Singapore British Naval Base, and that didn't work out too well when the Japanese buddy took it over very soon. And these submarines are meant to be a similar form to that of being up there.
Lockheed Martin, ladies and gentlemen, are the world's largest producer of killing machines.
The people of Ukraine are the victims. They have been caught in the middle of a war between the United States and Russia, and neither the United States nor Russia cares about the thousands and thousands of people who have died in Ukraine. But these companies are the ones that are the real winners. Their share price has gone through the roof. They are making billions at the expense of people's lives, livelihoods, and their homes. And they continue to do that. And our government allows them to operate from our soil.
Australia is a top 5. In fact, we're currently 4th at importing arms, so we're a big customer.
The 4th largest importer of weapons in the world, Australia.
That's right.
A country with 26 million people.
Yes.
What a great record to hold up and be proud of, eh?
We'll visit Brendan Nelson later in the day. Yes. Yeah, don't shade your eyes, shade your eyes. This is horrifying. We've got Christopher Pyne, former Minister, now part of Albert Systems, NIA, and this is the architect of the Australian Missile Corporation.
Christopher Pyne is a recent example that a lot of people would remember. As Defence Minister, he was actually talking with EY, which is a consulting firm, one of the big 4 in the world, and he 9 days after leaving Parliament took a position with them. They have a large defence practice. Having been Defence Minister in Cabinet and talking with them about it while he was still the Defence Minister. So he basically makes a mockery of the ministerial standards, which everyone recognised at the time.
Internal government documents show senior members of the Defence Department were told to publicly dismiss concerns about Christopher Pyne's new job as a contractor. The talking points reportedly instructed officials to say what Mr Pyne chooses to do post his ministerial employment are not defence issues.
As well as his lobbying firm, Christopher Pyne has also now moved on to the boards of various defence-related companies. So there's an Australian one called NIA, N-I-O-A. It sells ammunition and it's grown quite a lot in recent years. It's now also involved in the Australian Missile Corporation and bidding for the production of missiles here. The Yemen war is little known in Australia, not very much reported. It's been going on since early 2015. I could make an analogy for you. Everyone is quite rightly upset with Russia invading Ukraine. Anyone supplying weapons to Russia is rightly condemned. There's terrible war crimes going on there. On the other side, we have the Yemen war, which has been going on since 2015. The USA has been the major supplier of weaponry into the Saudis, untold war crimes there as well. Something like 3/4 of the population is in need of aid. Children are starving to death for lack of food. It's a really terrible situation, and the US is a big arms supplier there, as well as the UK, and as I was saying, our Australian firm is also supplying the Saudis and the UAE.
On August 9th, Zaid's son Osama filmed his class on their long-awaited school trip, a reward for graduating summer school. Within hours, and it had all gone horribly wrong. A plane from the US-backed Saudi-led coalition struck a bus carrying them. Dozens died. Some of the bodies were so mutilated, identification became impossible. All that's left are the scraps of school books, warped metal, and a single backpack. Munitions experts tell CNN this was a US-made Mark Mk-82 bomb, weighing in at half a ton. The first 5 digits there are the cage number, the commercial and government entity number. This number here denotes Lockheed Martin, one of the top US defense contractors.
In recent years, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has been one of the key and strongest voices in Australia with the increasing rhetoric against China and the huge threat that China apparently presents.
We need to have an army with more hitting power and more range, and that's what these weapons will give them. The government can't hide the fact that China is both an important market and the potential aggressor that every other country in the region is worried about. And I think the acid test for government is balancing those two realities.
One of the problems with ASPI is that it's part of its charter is that it's independent of government and the defence organisation. It's supposed to be independent. So when we start having 1, 2 former defence ministers sitting on the governing council, you know, you're calling into question how independent the organisation really is, particularly when it's accepting large amounts of funding from the US government as well as the Australian government. They ought to be also independent of the influence of the arms industry, because the arms industry is so closely enmeshed in this secretive relationship with governments that they can't really be prized apart. So if an organisation such as ASPI wants to maintain the perception, which is what it says in its charter, the perception as well as the reality of its independence, it needs to take heed of that and consider that perhaps being sponsored by arms industry isn't a good idea.
One reason why it is so important to oppose, for example, the facile adoption of nuclear propulsion for Australian submarines is not only the strategic dangers, helping to contribute to an existential threat to China, not only the fact that it will encourage a nuclear industry in Australia, we have very little in the way of nuclear safeguard capacities domestically, but obviously it will open the door to other countries in East Asia and other parts of the world getting the same technology. It will be impossible for the Americans to say, oh no, we're not giving Japan this, we're not giving South Korea this. They're frontline allies against China.
The build-up of Australia's military offensive capabilities, particularly with the eventual nuclear power submarines, but also with things like the B-52s and eventually the more modern nuclear-capable bombers being based in Australia, is all part of the process of preparing Australia to be the protagonist on behalf of the United States in a war against China. In other words, if they cannot get Taiwan to be the proxy or the patsy, then it will be Australia.
As the wind blows, it's just 2 hours flight from Darwin to Alice Springs, and another 27 kilometres drive to Pine Gap, the US military's top secret spy base.
Pine Gap has one very important role in the event of American nuclear war, which is to indicate what are potential targets for an American second strike on China.
Pine Gap is absolutely key to the command and control of United States forces in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And Pine Gap, in fact, covers most of the territory of Russia.
The facilities at Pine Gap can compute the location of the launch, the time, absolutely the precise time of the launch, the trajectory, which can be calculated from projecting from its initial trajectory, and can then inform the American and Japanese missile defence facilities on land and at sea that if those interceptor missiles are then pointed at a particular part of the sky, not the whole sky, but just a very particular part, then their radars have a chance of picking up the incoming Chinese missile and destroying them.
Deedle-dum-dum, deedle-dum-dum, there was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him...
This is a US government film made in 1951 to help Americans deal with the reality if an atomic bomb hit their town or city.
He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
In the case of China, those 1,800 deployed weapons that the Americans have, and another 3,000 or so in the locker ready to go, are an order of magnitude bigger than what China has, which is about 350, perhaps 400, something like that. Now, it's not a matter of a seesaw, 400 one side, 1,800 on the other. It's also the fact that the Americans have vastly more sophisticated systems for targeting, for missile defence. Chinese fire their missiles. American Missile Defence Shield will stop a certain number of those, probably a lot. We don't really know.
We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Now, you and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the Turtle, so we have to cover up in our own way. First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck and your face. Duck and cover underneath a table or desk or anything else close by.
If Russia, for example, wanted to send a signal to the United States, using nuclear weapons as signalling sound is horrific and awful, but it's certainly part of the plan. And if it wanted to say to the United States, don't go any further, we are really serious about this. One way in which that could be done technically and possibly politically quite effectively from the Russian point of view wouldn't to be use a small or a single nuclear attack on a target that the Americans think is important. To do that, they wouldn't want to do something which is so important as to provoke a huge American attack. They certainly wouldn't want to target an American city. One of the most obvious signalling operations that's been considered by Australian nuclear planners, not that we've ever done anything about it, is that Pine Gap would be a very good signalling target with the virtue of destroying part of an American capability, nowhere near a major population centre, an American ally, but not America. Any nuclear attack on Pine Gap, of course, would destroy the facility, but the fire and blast effects on Alice Springs would be horrific.
10 seconds to go. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. The mighty power of the atom is unleashed.
We must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. This family knows what to do, just as your own family should. They know that even a thin cloth helps protect them. Even a newspaper can save you from a bad burn. But the most important thing of all is to duck and cover yourself, especially where your clothes do not cover you.
If anything happens to start the nuclear ball rolling, A, it's going to be unstoppable, and B, it's going to be horrific every way round. The first responsibility of an Australian government is to think about the well-being of Australians, the security of Australians. And so very basic questions about civil defence, about the defensibility of Pine Gap, and it's not defensible, and the value to Australians has to consider the well-being of the people of Alice Springs and the region around it.
All the things that health services need to operate. They need communications, transport, clean water, sewage, etc., all their supplies, all of the things which would be virtually destroyed in the event of a nuclear war. So that's it's one of the overwhelming reasons why we say that health services would have very little to offer in the event of a nuclear war. And that was the experience at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
When the Prime Minister sits in his chair, and when the Foreign Minister sits in her chair, and when the Defence Minister sits in his chair, they speak for the country. Polls show that notwithstanding our concerns or grievances, Australian people do not want to be involved in a conflict between the United States and China. Young people in particular want this country to remain neutral.
We also have to start thinking much more carefully about how we work with other countries in the region. Now, a lot of Australian political leaders talk about working with countries in the region, but if you look at what we've done over the last few years, increasingly, our diplomacy in Asia with countries like the countries of Southeast Asia or Japan or South Korea or India for that matter, have been to talk to them about how important it is for everyone to support America to remain the dominant power in East Asia. Now, if that's not going to work, then making that the focus of our regional diplomacy is a dead end. What we need to do is to go to these countries and say, okay, we're all going to be living in a region in which China is at the very least going to be playing a more dominant role than it used to play. So we have to start thinking much more carefully about how we manage China, how we do it individually, and how we can do it cooperatively. That's not in the sense of building a sort of an Asian confrontation containment alliance like NATO against China. It's a matter of just learning to live with the new facts of power. And I think so that would be a very different kind of regional diplomacy. The other thing I think we have to do is to start rethinking what's happening with India. Because India is a very big part of this picture. There's not just one rising great Asian power, there's two. India's a couple of decades behind China. It's taking a different path, and it's probably going to be a more winding path. It's not just going to grow straight the way China's grown, but it's going to get there. It's going to have a bigger population than China's. It's going to have the second biggest economy in the world. It's going to have a very formidable military, and it's going to have real strategic ambitions. It's going to end up, I think, being a great power, an ambitious great power, very much the way China is. And so we need to stop thinking of India simply as a country that we hope will counterbalance China and help us solve our China problem, and think of it as a great power in its own right, and we're going to have to manage our relations with India much as we manage our relations with China. That's bad news in some ways. It means we've got two potentially intrusive great powers to deal with, but it's also good news because it means we're going to have two great powers we can sort of play off against one another. I call this the sort of Mongolian model of foreign policy. Mongolia sits there between Russia and China, and its whole foreign policy is about playing those two guys off against one another. And I think that's going to be a little bit like Australia's position between India and China. They're both going to be establishing their spheres of influence. I think China is going to want to have a sphere of influence that covers East Asia and the Western Pacific. India is going to want to have a sphere of influence that covers South Asia and the Indian Ocean. We happen to sit on the boundaries between those two spheres of influence, and that means we're going to be pushed from both sides, which is bad, but it also means we can play both sides off against one another, so we can use the Indians to deflect the Chinese and the Chinese to deflect the Indians. That's going to be very difficult diplomacy, very different from the kind of diplomacy we've done in the past, but it's not impossible. It is in the end up to us to demand more of our leaders, and our leaders should be leading us, but we as a community have a much bigger responsibility, I think. And I think that's because Australians have been lucky. We have had very peaceful, very secure few decades, and I think we need to get over that. We need to understand what's going on.
This film is dedicated to my good mate Tony Barry. He recorded this final grabber narration just 3 days before he died. Tony was an actor and an activist. He devoted his life to peace, social justice and the environment.
We are the young they drafted out to wars their folly brought about.
Honourable Prime Minister, look at what we have to forgo. The vital services for millions of ordinary Australians if you and Defence Minister Richard Marles opt to buy 6 to 8 nuclear-powered submarines with a price tag attached that it will inevitably blow out in their lifetime before they have to be carefully decommissioned.
Albo, we used to revere our poets, and now we can't wait to shut the book on them. But these are the sensitives. They're the ones who know what we're getting up to. So we found this poem by A.D.H. Hope, one of Australia's great poets of the last century. It's called Inscription for War and was inspired by an anonymous tombstone found at the scene of the battle in ancient Greece, vastly outnumbered by the invading Persians. We are the one they drafted out to wars their follies brought about. Go tell those old men safe in bed. We took their orders and are now dead. Albo, contemplating going to war. Why, Albo? Why?
Rest in peace, TB. You've earned that final rest.